dinner and might get a leftovers.
Yes, I know.
All right, I think that Vemis is coming is probably is likely here, and Alana's guarding the doorways, and yes, right. So I want to wish everybody a good evening to you folks, and to you folks, it's absolutely delightful. There's 7 of you anyhow on the screen. That's probably just individual screens too. This is whole wonderful new world, isn't it? So this is our second evening of study on the redemption of Scrooge. And of course, we're bouncing off Matthew Rawls' book of that name. But, you know, as we said, as Alana said last week, you can get it if you'd like, and it would be useful as we go forward, but it's not absolutely necessary because we're kind of going wherever we think the direction takes us. I thought we'd start tonight with some compliment, just to get us sort of centered, remember where we are and whose we are, and away we go. Can everybody read that okay? You read that? I think that's all right. The Lord Almighty grant us a quiet night and a perfect end.
Amen.
Our help is in the name of the Lord.
Who made heaven and earth.
Keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn, or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake. That would be a bad prayer before the sermon, eh?
Might be too obvious.
Yeah, I prefer coffee.
And together, save us, O Lord, while waking, and guard us while sleeping, that awake we may watch with Christ, and asleep may rest in peace. Now, Lord, you let your servant go in peace.
Your word is fulfilled.
My own eyes have seen the salvation,
Which you have prepared in the sight of every people.
a light to reveal you to the nations.
And
The glory of your people Israel.
Come, O Lord, and visit us in peace, that we may rejoice before you with a perfect heart. Stir up your power, O God, and come among us, heal our wounds, calm our fears, and give us peace through Jesus, our Redeemer. And now back to Scrooge. Could give you whiplash going from Compline to Scrooge. Man of the worldly mind. So right, here we are in Advent, and we're well aware, because we drove here in the dark, that it is the northern world's darkest part of the year. And the news around us is pretty dark too, with resurging COVID numbers, floods in the east and west of Canada, the refugees flooding the world, wars, intrigue. And I'm thinking, I've been writing out Christmas cards lately, and I keep writing down the words fire, flood, pestilence. I mean, it's really positively Old Testament. There are opposing views on how we're going to get out of this darkness, and they're splitting us into hostile factions, and we're kind of noticing that more and more politically on the political and the international scene. There really is a remarkable parallel with Dickens and Scrooge's worlds, yet the Christmas Carol ends in redemption and hope. And we remember that appeals to us. I think that's part of why we love that book so much. So what is it in this Advent time, a time of waiting for redemption, that we can learn from this book? Eh? What is it that, you know, you've had a week to sort of sit on it and sort of have it bounce around in the back of your mind? What do you folks think that we're going to learn from this book, just as we start out?
Don't everyone speak at once.
I'd like to remind everybody just to speak up so our friends at home can hear us speak.
Well, you know what? Then let's wait and see, because this is one of the things that Rawls says is that the church is gathering in the present to ponder the past for a future hope. And isn't that what happened to Scrooge, eh? Yeah, he gathered he was in the present, he pondered the past, and his hope became evident. Now, last week, Alana gave us a very quick summary of the Christmas Carol, and of course, some of you have read the book. The odd person had not read the book. I have to tell you, we got a brand new shiny TV set. We tried it out on the Muppets Christmas Carol. And it was interesting because I noticed that there actually is a basic significant difference between the take of the Muppets Christmas Carol and Dickens' Christmas Carol. Maybe we can talk about that later. And no matter where you've been with that, the one thing we did agree on last week is who Scrooge is. You know, every time that word pops up, we have an image that comes to mind of who Scrooge is. And it's not a compliment, is it? No, it's not a compliment. Well, Alana went on after that to give us an historical context of the book, setting the time in which Dickens lived. And one of the things I read about it, to someone's comment, was Scrooge's London is a dystopian hellscape riddled by sickness, injustice, cold, and want. So I'm thinking also, I mean, we've got Michael here, and Michael, I found out last week, Michael, you are an historian, am I right?
Yes, that's true.
And you are a professor now, and you know this time well, this time in England well, I understand.
Not too bad. I've done some work over the years in this, particularly in the industrialization period, and the way in which it was like a tidal wave that swept the people in the rural countrysides into some of the most horrific cities we can imagine, like Manchester and Birmingham. It was just utterly ghastly. And it was a time of incredible upheaval and even transformations of the economy. So there would be kind of boom and bust. And some thinkers who try to link history with Scrooge, they try to point out that Scrooge was more than likely born in a time of the late 18th century to the early 19th century, and he's born in a time of deprivation. And so his experience of deprivation, so some argue, shaped his psyche. And it was interesting. Just one other thought. I've studied some of the radical movements that emerge in this period, and I wondered, if the working class, the English working class, which was just starting to awaken and organize, and it took cooperative form, the Chartist movement in the 1830s. But you see, what was that? I lost my point.
Oh, welcome to my world. I write it all down. I write it all down. Otherwise, we'd end up in some black hole or a wormhole.
Oh, I know what I was.
Here it is.
I know what I was going to say. It came back. I was just saying with Dickens. Yeah, I mean, what actually is occurring there is that the working class is becoming increasingly self-conscious, and apparently they love Dickens. And when Dickens, as I think we all know, used to do readings, public readings, and many times the readings that Dickens would perform would be in the cheap halls of England. So this man had a very sort of deep sense of the injustices that were just rife and rampant. And also old Karl Marx. This is the period of the young Marx and the young Engels, and Marx really liked Dickens. I'm not sure about Engels, but they really
Right.
liked his critique of bourgeois society.
Thank you for that, Michael. I have to tell you that Michael has the creds. Michael is a professor. In fact, we have a couple of professors sitting there with Carmen and Michael. So we're well equipped. You people bring all kinds of talents with you. And, you know, that's exactly the sort of thing that we're going to go into tonight, because what we're going to look at as who is this Scrooge? And you know, when you get past the image that we all have, bang, how did he get there? And I think we're going to have a look at that. What we have to remember about those times when you get into the details, that poor children were often sent to workhouses, and I read somewhere that in Victorian times, when Dickens was writing, there were, well, in 1861 anyway, there were 35,000 children under 12 living and working in poorhouses. And that gives you some idea. The living conditions, as Alana said, were absolutely wretched. The food was poor, the work was tough, discipline was harsh, whipping was common. There was barely enough food to keep you going in the workhouses, and there are all kinds of illustrations of those workhouses. And the amendment to the Poor Law in 1834 reduced aid to the point where those needing assistance really had no option but the workhouse. And one thing, it's not so different from how we live now, is it? I have to say that when I hear about the reduced aid, I think of the far right Republicans, which this seems to me, and I hope I'm not offending anybody or getting all political about it, that it's the setting, not just for Scrooge's story, but for our story and the world that Scrooge lived in. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to try and get past the impressions we have of him, and we're going to try and understand Scrooge the man. I mean, what was it that made him develop into a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. And actually, you might think about oyster, and the hard shells and how it defends itself or shuts itself off from the world. Scrooge says, I want to be left alone. Do you remember that? Now, what do you want me to put you down for? I want to be left alone, says Scrooge. And that made me think of the time when Bishop John Baycroft, that would be Bishop John the First, came to St. Thomas, where I was the rector, and it must have been Holy Week. And he was preaching about Judas, and he said, Judas went off to ton idios, his own place. Idiosyncrasy, eh? Judas went off to his own place. And there we have kind of a parallel between Judas and Scrooge. Just a thought there. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. Mercy, he said, dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me? Man of the worldly mind, replied the ghost, do you believe in me or not? I do, said Scrooge, I must, but why do spirits walk the earth? And why do they come to me? Man of the world, man of the world. We all of us live, don't we? As churchgoers, we live kind of with one foot in the world and one foot in the kingdom. And whenever I think of that image of one foot on the pier and one foot on the boat, and the boat sort of slipping away. So what is it that the world might think of Scrooge's journey, eh? There's Scrooge before and Scrooge after, and that was quite a journey. Now, I want to ask you people, I want you to put your thinking caps on, and I want you to pipe up an answer this time. What does it matter what one person thinks? Who the heck cares what Scrooge thought? Does it matter?
Yeah,
Why?
every person matters.
Okay. And how?
There's two, go ahead, Don.
No, you,
There's two factors.
Loud?
I'm muffled. There are two factors, his own salvation and the effect that he has on everybody else. That is the double-barreled thing you're looking at. And that's why it matters. It matters what any of us think. We have to stand before God sometime. And at the moment, we're here in the midst of the people. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And his influence is dictated by his own personal wealth. Because even though he's miserly and he does control the purse strings, as we know, with Bob Cratchit and limiting the lump of coal he gets to feed himself with, or how he feeds his family. So what he says matters because he can use his influence for good or evil.
Okay.
I noted when I was watching the Muppets Christmas Carol that they did a lot of evictions. People couldn't pay, boom, out they went on the street. Now, whether that came up in Dickens, I'm not, I don't remember that did, but yeah.
I think it matters what we say and what we think. We don't know what influence we will have on a particular person. And I'll take it as something very personal. I've had cancer. I never told anybody for years that I had cancer. And then it was somebody came up and had cancer. She thought, you know, I had cancer 3 years ago. I was going, and you're doing all this? It was just a simple comment. And it made a great deal of influence for someone who's going through a very tough time. So we don't know when we're going to influence that person.
All right, yes, yes, and sometimes, do you know, it's funny, sermons. You know, you get up and you do your blah, 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 whatever you've sort of thought about. Somebody will come and stand at the back and they'll say, thank you so much. It was just what I needed to hear. I heard blah, blah, blah. And you weren't even aware that you said it. But there's something that comes out in that relationships. And I think relationships, that is a word that we want to keep in our mind all the time as we're going through this. Really, it's about relationships. We're hearing it a lot from the pulpit these days, which is great. You know, it's one thing to say love, you know, it's a beautiful word, but it's lost a lot of its impact now because we use it so much. It's relationships. And of course, Scrooge's relationships were wretched. Yeah. So what was it that hardened Scrooge into such a wretch? Well, I had the loveliest time waltzing through pages and pages on the web of attempted psych evaluations. And on the art side, you know, of an amateur trying it, there was a 2019 production of The Christmas Carol, scripted by Jack Thorne. And you have to think that this is the Trump era. There's another word that we can keep in our mind. And Thorne speaks of the lost and lonely little boy in Scrooge. Well, most of us don't think that sympathetically about Scrooge when we, you know, when the name first hits us. And in an interview with The Guardian, he said, when I reread the book, I was astonished by its beauty and power. Dickens wrote it in anger, and I love him for that. It's been relevant since that word austerity came into politics a decade ago. Hidden behind that word is a lot of prejudice about working class people. And there is that, isn't there? There's just read, I mean, I'm going off on sidetracks. I shouldn't be going off this at all, but there was one on merit, the tyranny of merit. And what it was saying, I mean, we went from aristocracy. And we thought, well, we don't mind leaving that behind, but meritocracy, well, that's good, isn't it? And then we find out how people can twist the merit system. And, we get all kinds of, well, I'm rich, therefore I must be good. God is smiling on me, I'm clever. See, you may be rich because you won the lottery. You may be rich because you just happen to be in the right place at the right time. There is prejudice about poor people. And again, I think about what's going on. Republicans versus Democrats. I don't think either of them is perfect. Neither am I. But anyway, what this fellow says is Scrooge is beset by that prejudice, and removing it is the most important thing in the play. At the same time, we are all Scrooges. Oh, for Pete's sake, that's like we have to stand up in church and say we're all sinners. Now here we're having to say we're all Scrooges. Oh, my goodness. We all have responsibility for the world and the damage that we do. And maybe with a bit of self-reflection, we can change. This is the fellow who wrote the play, Jack Thorne, speaking about this. Anyway, just a question here. Is this inspection of the Christmas Carol relevant again? Does it have anything to say to us in 2021?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
It's about the human condition.
okay.
Things don't, people haven't changed how they are. Some people have risen above, but there's far less Mother Teresa's in the world than people who are just out for their own benefit.
Can you people on the web hear what's being said?
It's
Yeah.
muffled. It's very muffled. So if you could repeat perhaps some of the main words or the main idea.
All right. Well, yeah,
Briefly.
Alana was great about that last week. She did that, and the reply was yes, it certainly is relevant, and that people are still people. I think that was perhaps the human condition is still the human condition, and the temptations we have are still the temptations we have.
Yeah, I'd like to add that the Christmas Carol, as we see this Scrooge, his awakening unfolding, and I think Scrooge really challenges us to understand what is it exactly that is going to provide a mirror for ourselves. How are we going to see how heartless we are, let's say, as we're in a world of commerce and calculation? What is it that's going to trigger an awakening process?
Yeah, fair enough. Yes.
I was just gonna say, your question was about, is it relevant to today? So I have to tell you what happened at IGA on Saturday. It was the food bank was collecting, and we were at different doors, and we had lots of generous, not lots, we had some generous people, but a lady came by just screaming and yelling at us, like really causing a scene. We said, but we're here with the food. Well, she thought we were too close. She thought there was too many of us. There was 2 were leaving and 2 of us were coming. We were changing sort of shift there. And we said, but it's the food bank. And we're just trying to, and there was no way. So if we look at the relevance after, when she literally flapped her arms and ran around back, and we don't know if she complained to the store manager. And then at the end, she said, well, my husband has cancer, and if you all stand close together, you're going to spread COVID. So in a way, that's, if we think Scrooge, maybe the story says he's had an unhappy childhood, rejected or not included with friends. And so that's kind of the backstory to this lady, but she sure was very Scrooge-like. And actually, one of the volunteers said Merry Christmas to her, and she was in a rage. So it's still relevant today. We still have those examples.
Well, I don't know how well you folks heard that, but this was an experience at the grocery store where the food bank folk were in there, I guess, accepting donations. Yeah. And just a couple of them, and then the couple coming in to relieve. And a woman came in, obviously very upset about something. And she's waving her arms in the air and she's yelling at them saying, "You're too close together. There are too many of you. This is terrible." And on she went. And it came out that her husband had cancer. And she was afraid that this was going to increase transmission and, you know, he was likely to get it. And so, you know, she was being definitely Scrooge-like. But on the other hand, somewhere behind her, there was a reason she was so upset. So here's the world we live. We talked about the human condition. Here's the world we live in.
I'd
Okay.
like to add something about that.
Yeah.
That this might help us to understand just the situation in the grocery store, and then of course Scrooge's responses to others. And that is, when a person interacts in a particular way, that's in response to something else. And in this case, it's a response to a profound need and responsibility to protect another person who is vulnerable. And so when you're on the receiving end of somebody who's upset and angry and waving their arms around, and they might look threatening and you might feel threatened, it's always really good to have an open heart and to not react in an aggressive way, but in a most compassionate and open way, because that other person is really trying to protect a vulnerable one. So it's a response. And you know, in this time of COVID-19, whenever we go out in public, there is a risk of contracting this virus. So maybe in Scrooge's time, when people go out in public, when they went out in public, there was a risk that they would be abused or in some way. So this story is relevant. The circumstances might be different. The examples, the different types of interaction might be different, but they're related in my mind. And let's be compassionate. I learned something about ourselves and about people we care about, and also people we don't even know who may be vulnerable.
What I haven't told these folk is that you guys are both professors, and you taught nursing, and was it psychology and nursing?
It was mental health nursing, and then ethics and how they interrelate. So it's all about relationship, communication, trust, but that ethical dynamic. And in this, when I think about Scrooge, I think about the ethical responsibility to share resources equitably throughout society. More about that later.
That's, yeah, exactly. And that's one thing. And the other side is what you referred to in the beginning, which is the misplaced anger, the anger that arises from another situation entirely and erupts in whatever situation people are in. In this case, it was a related situation, but
yeah,
thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Right, there's a difference between Scrooge's behavior, which is based on self-centeredness and selfishness, and this woman who I'm not saying it's justified in a way, but it's understandable.
Yeah.
Because it's coming from a place of fear. And we can talk about staying home, you know, because that's safer than going out, but it's been almost 2 years and you have to go get groceries. You know, it doesn't excuse behavior, but I mean, that's fundamentally what the Christmas Carol shows, is you have the practice who have you know, as many privations as Scrooge evidently did in growing up. They have chosen to be generous and loving with each other, and Scrooge has chosen to be his oyster-like self.
Yeah. And who's hurt by that?
Yes.
Yes, yes. I don't know whether you folks heard it, but the difference between Scrooge and the lady was that she had a concern for someone. Scrooge only had a concern for himself. I think that's Michael.
One thing I think would be not the same is Scrooge then tended to treat himself the same way he was treating other people. He wouldn't have bread because it cost pennies more. He wouldn't use coal because he'd sooner freeze. He didn't have a lavish place. He never changed anything in his house. But I think modern day Scrooges that have lots of money would sooner fly up to space and waste it instead of putting it in a pot saying, there, it's all mine. They're just showing everybody, look, I can spend it on frivolous things. I think that's a bit of a difference.
Ah, there we have, yeah, a modern day Scrooge and the old Scrooge. Scrooge was definitely hard on himself, was he not? And a modern day Scrooge might not be so much. Well, let's move on a little bit. I would like you to think this way. Imagine that you have the following. You have a very crabby and very wealthy uncle. And one day he comes to you and he says that he's seen ghosts. Not just one ghost, he's seen 4 ghosts. 4 ghosts. There they all are. And he's saying, but now I'm a changed man. So how do you respond to this uncle? You know, you kind of feel you have to look after him. And I think what you might very well do is take your uncle to a psychologist, might you not? Okay. And the psychologist might indeed say this. You might say, Mr. Scrooge appears to be coherent. He's able to identify place, time, and people. He reports no other delusions or hallucinations, with the exception of the events he reports that took place on Christmas Eve. Now, the diagnostic considerations for this, well, he appears to be coherent and stable. The initial impressions of Mr. Scrooge's symptoms indicate a possibility of bipolar disorder. These symptoms include sudden onset of extreme mood fluctuations, racing thoughts, increased social activity, and a decreased need for sleep. However, these symptoms are balanced with intermittent periods of deep thought and reflection, occurring several times within the same day. Mr. Scrooge is able to remain calm and collected for long periods of time. He also reports no symptoms of depression. Therefore, he does not meet the criteria for bipolar hypomania, which is a revved up energy or activity level, or cyclothymia, emotional ups and downs. Due to the sudden onset of Mr. Scrooge's psychotic-like symptoms, hallucinations and delusions, and the extremely short duration of these symptoms, one night, Mr. Scrooge does not meet criteria for schizophrenia or schizophreniform. Although Mr. Scrooge's thinking is somewhat symptomatic of delusional thinking, in that he maintains that the hallucinations he experienced on Christmas Eve were real, he otherwise displays no indications of irrational thought. It seems more likely that Mr. Scrooge experienced a brief psychotic episode. Although undiagnosed, Mr. Scrooge appears to have suffered from obsessive compulsive personality disorder in the past, as evidenced by his hoarding money and extreme work history. People who suffer from personality disorders are more at risk to experience a brief psychotic disorder than the general population. It's impossible to diagnose Mr. Scrooge with this disorder, however, since he has no current symptoms. As for Mr. Scrooge's current mental status, he appears to be competent. Although he's giving away large sums of his money and is very emotional, he's able to mentally assess the risks of his behavior. Mr. Scrooge does not appear to be a danger to himself or to others. So this was, I think, somebody having a good time in the psychological world. It's interesting to note, though, that psychologists looking at Charles Dickens said this. They said that emotionally, Dickens was really quite unstable. There was the obvious English restraint that we're well aware of, but he seems quite unstable underneath all of that. He was in fact capable of great hardness and cruelty, and not merely toward those that he had the cause to resent. Apparently on one occasion he was having a dinner party and there were guests there, and he ordered his close friend and advisor, John Forster, out of his house over some discussion that had arisen at dinner. And his treatment of Mrs. Dickens suggests, someone said, the behavior of a Renaissance monarch summarily consigning to a convent the wife who had served her term. Dickens ditched his wife. And Dickens himself wrote this. He said, the deep remembrance of the sense I had, being utterly neglected and hopeless, of the shame I felt in my position, of the misery of it, was to my young heart to believe that day by day, what I had learned and thought and delighted in and raised my fancy and my emulations up by, was passing away from me, never to be brought back any more, that cannot be written. My whole nature was so penetrated with the grief and humiliation of such considerations that even now, famous and caressed and happy, I often forget in my dreams that I have a dear wife and children, even that I am a man, and wander disconsolately, desolately back to that time in my life. So I don't, anybody here follow Richard Rohr? Yeah, the odd head nodding. He's a Franciscan monk down in the States, and quite a following. I really like his work, and we've actually done some of his stuff here in book studies. And Rohr talks about the true self and the false self. And the false self is when the ego gets so involved and we create this persona. And the true self is what lies underneath that, if we can cut through the nonsense. That's not a terribly good description of it, but the best I can do right now. Evangelist John Bradshaw discusses what he calls the inevitable development of the false self, which surfaces as a direct result of parental abandonment, which was certainly a factor for Dickens. I don't know that his father was so much cruel as just totally incapable and incompetent. And of course, father went off to debtor's prison, and young Dickens went off to a workhouse situation. So these are certainly factors in both Dickens and Scrooge's lives. So Dickens is writing whereof he knows. In an attempt to mask the inner pain and loneliness of the neglected true self or wounded inner child, the false self eventually leads people to become either more than human by taking on the role of an abuser, or less than human by taking on the role of the abused. So let's have another look at the journey through life. We know that he had this father, that Scrooge had this father who rejected him. What happened, of course, was Scrooge's mother died giving birth to Scrooge, and the father could not help but blame Scrooge for this happening. And Scrooge was certainly rejected. And I think we have to remember this as a key throughout the rest of this, throughout the scenes from the Ghost of Christmas Past. We have the memorable scene at the boarding school. Right? Poor Scrooge. Everybody else has left. All the other kids have gone back to their happy families, and he's left alone at the boarding school. And it's Christmas time. So really, poor Scrooge. And we feel the sadness for him. However, in the midst of this, there is a spark. And that's his sister Fan. Right? Fan comes to take him home. As I remember, the words are, father's much better now, kinder, gentler, whatever. Well, that doesn't follow, that doesn't develop. We don't really find out what happens, but this is the beginning of a little spark of light. And when we go on from that, we go on to Fezziwig's ball. So there are various moments in this. It's not all doom and gloom. We're seeing some happiness, and certainly there was great enthusiasm on Scrooge's part when it came to talking about Fezziwig's ball. And I'm wondering with you folks, as you read this or looked at it, when did you begin to get some kind of an idea that maybe there was going to be redemption? When did these little sparks of light come on? Yeah?
I didn't get a whole lot of redemption out of the Ghost of Christmas Past, but when he was concerned about Tiny Tim, then he sort of
Okay.
felt something for somebody other than himself.
Okay, and
That was but in the beginning though, in this part where he seems to see himself as a wounded child. You know, I think he sees a lot of this. Fezziwig's ball was kind of the opposite of the wounded child though. Like there he has a chance of being happy with Belle. And dancing, he loved dancing.
yeah, yeah. And this is someone saying that really they're not seeing this so much until it gets to Tiny Tim. And when you see the feeling for Tiny Tim, he said there you begin to see a soft spot, perhaps in Scrooge. Where are we going now? Of course, then we have Belle. And I think this is kind of the opposite. This is more a hardening, isn't it? Yes?
But does he not do this to himself? This is almost like he's being a kamikaze because he's engaged to this girl forever and he never commits. And as a consequence, he loses her. But he's done it to himself. Like it's almost like he won't allow himself the happiness in his young life.
Scrooge won't allow himself the happiness in his young life. There's, yeah. Okay, it's certainly choosing a direction, isn't it?
He alludes to that though when he's talking at the ball, when he talks to the coworker and he says, someday when, I forget the words he uses, someday when I have enough money, then I'm going to marry her. Because he never has enough.
That's not in the book, though, that's in the.
Is that in the movie?
That's in the Muppets.
I'm gonna tell you something.
And what's in the book?
No, we're gonna talk about this more in week 4 when we talk about adaptations, but there's a lot of things that we think of are in the story and they're not. They're from film and television adaptations.
I have to read and watch the show.
How isn't it fall at all in the story?
No.
Oh.
Did I tell you there was going to be a test?
Is it all Scrooge's fault though? Because in the book, he's happy where he was. And he gets coerced to change jobs and make more money at another firm and then move up the ladder. He was kind of happy where he was in the firm he was until somebody came in and said,
You mean at Fezziwig's?
yeah, he's happy there. And he got coerced
By whom?
by what the new companies with
That's not in the book.
no.
Yeah, we gotta read it.
By Marley?
Not in the book.
Now we get confused, don't we?
Yeah, the conversation going on right now is that there is a lot of stuff coming out of movies and books and movies that are not actually in the book. And certainly I did notice in the Muppets Christmas Carol, the one thing I noticed at the end in the Muppets, as we watched it, was Scrooge going around giving presents to everybody. And I thought, oh boy, this is an American film. You know, because that.
It's a physical manifestation of what's going on internally in the story.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You gotta do shorthand. And that's the thing about adaptations, which we will talk about more in week 4, is that was chosen because it's a different medium.
Yeah. Yeah. So, oh, Hollywood. So, here we are with Scrooge, okay, and how much do you think that these childhood events and the events of the society around him dictated who he was? I mean, Dickens is writing this. Dickens has experienced all of this. He's glued labels onto bootblack bottles. And he's suffered in the, I forget what it is. It can't be, certainly wasn't in the Muppets. Oh, I know, it was in the Invention of Christmas, or,
The man who invented Christmas.
yeah, The Man Who Invented Christmas, right. And the father's parting words as he's carted off to debtor's prison: remember that you are a gentleman. Don't let anybody say that you are not a gentleman. I don't remember that in the book coming out as part of Scrooge's thing, but certainly it would be part of the anguish of the hopes and dreams of Dickens as a child, and the way life was, and all of a sudden it was not. So I'm thinking is there more that we want to say about Scrooge? I would love it if you folks had some stuff that you could add on to who Scrooge was. Ed?
He was very happy when his sister came, but didn't she die in childbirth with his nephew?
She's dead, but we don't know how.
Don't know them.
I'm sorry, we don't know how Scrooge's mother died either. And this is younger sister, right?
Yes.
So she didn't die giving birth to him.
Well, Fan obviously didn't know, but yeah.
Dickens never says in the story.
What
Yeah.
Dickens did say was the ghost said she had a child, didn't she? The implication was that she died.
Well, that's Fred, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Fred was the child that his sister Fan gave birth to. There's no indication in the book that she died in childbirth. She might have died
No.
2 months afterwards, or 2 or 3 years.
It's implied, but we don't know.
It's the implications.
But a lot of adaptations will put that detail in to make it all more poignant, right? And to make Scrooge's indifference to Fred stronger.
And again, we're talking about the influence of adaptations and the fact that these little things like Fan dying in childbirth, which Dickens doesn't say, the poignancy of it to make it sort of clutch at your heart.
Everybody is keen to out Dickens, and quite understandable.
Everybody is keen to out Dickens, says Carl. There we go. There we go. Yes.
Also, if you think of the period that this book was written, it would be considered indelicate to talk about a woman dying in childbirth or around that thing.
Or
You know what I
childbirth
mean? To
at all.
focus on the perils, but it just would be an indelicate subject.
There
It was-
are ways to describe it in a delicate manner,
Yes.
but obviously Dickens doesn't think that's important. That's
Well,
not the point.
yeah, yeah.
Or he would have said.
And now we're discussing the Victorian delicacies of what you could talk about and what you couldn't. And of course, you could not talk about sex, politics. What's the other thing? Religion. Oh, yeah, religion. Here we are. And we're smashing that whole thing right to bits. There we go.
Well, it depends who you're talking about. The genteel class, which is not necessarily the upper class, or less the upper middle class, they had the little delicacies and so on. The lower class, the working class, they just
Survived.
faced it and said it, and probably in very basic English. And of course, the upper class could say anything. They could get away with it.
And my understanding was the upper class appeared to be very pure, and there was a whole lot going on behind closed doors.
This is early Victorian period before we really have that veneer of civility that's comes in the later Victorian period, right? This is the first few years of Victoria's reign.
Yeah.
She's only been queen for 5 years. At this point.
Yeah.
Hang on. 5 young years, yeah. very young.
Hangover from George, the.
Well,
George-
true,
George-
yes,
George's
yes,
son.
whiplash from George to Victoria. Yeah, okay. All right. So,
I have
other,
a thought. I have a
Yeah.
thought, please. Here's another way of looking at Scrooge, is that given, I haven't read the book, so I'm just going by the Alistair Sim movie that I've watched many times. And I'm just wondering if Scrooge's way of being in his world is a direct response to his childhood trauma of being abandoned by his father or neglected by his father, and poor relationship with his sister, although he loves her, right? And so all of his behaviors as an adult are there to protect him, because he perceives that relationship is risky and can be harmful and hurtful. And so that's my idea. And to simplify, if I go outside in -30-degree weather here in Ottawa, without wearing the right clothing, I'm going to have frostbite. So I'm going to stay away from that cold weather, or I'm going to protect myself. So Scrooge is protecting himself from the potential harm of relationship. That's
that
an
makes
idea.
a lot of sense. That makes a lot of, and I think in various situations, we do that ourselves, don't we?
Mhm.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
We assess a risk, and we determine what risk is livable and which ones we need to avoid at all costs, right? To preserve our well-being, right?
And you can see as well, can't you, that that these feelings that Scrooge has would be intensified by the economic and political conditions within which Scrooge exists. That
Mhm.
maybe he thinks that if his business fails or goes under, he's out in the streets, and he knows
Yeah.
what the streets are like, and
Yeah.
so it's accumulate in order to protect yourself.
And Dickens has experienced this. I mean, it's not just he's seen it, he has experienced it. He's been in the midst of it. So he knows whereof he writes.
Yeah, you can also say that we can understand very profoundly and deeply the desire to protect yourself, and but God, I'm losing my points.
Well, the desire to protect yourself is profound, and until a person is in that situation that they feel threatened in some way, you can't predict how that protection is going to look, right? So it might look like you're hoarding a resource, or it might look like you're isolating yourself from others, because relationship with others is risky. So you can't really tell, but I find him a really fascinating character, and I really like this depiction from this sort of tongue-in-cheek psychologist that you talked about. No, it's not depression. Oh no, he's not really bipolar. Well, it's not schizophrenia, or it's not a personality disorder. He's not manipulative, or other features, but this obsessive compulsive way of thinking and behaving can become just a natural way of being, and you don't even think of it as something abnormal. It's just the way you happen to be, right?
All right, now let's take a moment, and because I find that when I dump water all over this, I left one page of it behind, but it obviously was not necessary. We have these two Scrooges, and obviously we prefer the after to the before, though I must say, I mean, Alistair Sims, what can you say? Yeah, I love the guy. Anyway, what is it in us that is so critical of Scrooge? Where do we find those values that make us so critical of who he was beforehand, and so appreciative and filled with rejoicing of the after Scrooge?
It's because we're terrified, because we know ourselves fairly intimately, if we have any internal honesty, that we have, and we have demonstrated to a smaller or lesser or a greater degree, the same defects that the Scrooge the First had. We desperately would like to be like the second Scrooge. And most times we're scared. We're not making that great a fist of it, now, are we? And it's the whole thing, the whole self-defense thing. I don't want to get back into the psychological jargon, but I think the bottom line is when everybody is out to get you, paranoia is simply good thinking.
Did you follow that logic there? When everybody is out to get you, paranoia is simply good thinking. I remember paranoia will destroy you, but Carl said, not necessarily, it may save you. Well, I think the question I'd like, here we're a group of churchgoers here, where we come to church, obviously not because we want to impress the people who aren't coming. We come to church because we're looking for something, all right? What is the magnet that is drawing us to this place?
Partly something to keep us from becoming like Scrooge before. That every Sunday you hope that you will get some sort of little push to go to in the right direction and not the wrong direction.
My shtick is I come to church to be transformed. I do. I wish to be transformed. I wish some power that is either within me or beyond me, because I can't reach out and grab it and put a name to it. But I wish to be transformed, and I know that there is a direction in which I would like to go. And I am not, Ed can certainly tell you that I don't always go in that direction, but you know, there is something there. There is direction. And I'm wondering if this is an aha moment for Scrooge. I mean, certainly there's an enormous transformation. Do you think it's unlikely? Or do you think that for some people it does happen that way? Like St. Paul. I mean, you gotta figure St. Paul was a bit of a Scrooge before Saul was, before he became Paul.
Well, sometimes there's that little whisper that tells you to go a certain way and you ignore it. And then it gets louder, and then it gets louder. And then sometimes it's like a slap upside the head. And it's like, okay, I better listen because this is the direction I need to go. And you don't know sometimes where it's coming from, and sometimes it's a little nudge, but you need more than that. So sometimes I think coming to church and listening to whatever, even conversations you have with other people, can be transformative.
Very good. That sounds like actually the story of my ordination. God is a nag. You know, nudge, nudge, elbow, slap along the head. Poke, yeah, and a lot of clergy will tell you this. I just thought, well, that's all right. I'm just going crazy. No problem. No, it is, but we know, I think we're hungry. I think inside us somewhere, there is this voice that whispers in our ear, and we don't necessarily hear it in so many words or with the rational part of our mind even. But you're hungry for it, yes.
He was miserable. Like he probably felt miserable too. And he's probably looking, through this lens from the ghosts and seeing his misery, but also some happy times. And then I don't know if it's just a light comes on or an epiphany, but I think it was sort of a gradual thing with each ghost that he kind of wakened up to his wretchedness and felt he needed to change. And how he does that, I guess, is the happy face there. It's almost like an end, finally. It doesn't even happen just, at the end, he's screaming for help, really, with that third ghost.
Yes,
I'm scared of you.
yes, I fear you more than any other, yes.
Because he faces his own mortality. Yes, he's seeing, this is the future. Is this really?
And people are going to
How-
remember me
is
this
how they're
way.
gonna remember. They're gonna be fighting over your rags and your clothing and
And I don't like,
and that's the end result of your life. This.
I don't like who I am.
No, exactly.
And it's a progression, right? Like I think, when we read the story, it only happens in one night, or it only happens in one movie, is the case with me, right? And it seems fast. But it's about the journey of his life, where, everything's your Scrooge, this is your life, right? And he gets to the end of it, and what does he have to show for it? What were the things that had meant something at the time that he let go? It's what you were saying, right? It's a process, and he gets there at the end of it, and that's, the end result of the journey.
Do you think we ever get there?
Well, that's the question.
We'll find out.
Oh, well, I wasn't necessarily thinking of heaven. I was thinking of the journey. Better to travel hopefully than to arrive. And I think you folks are here because you want to keep thinking about things. And you folks are tuned in because you want to keep thinking about things, and you're hoping somebody's going to say something interesting at some point. which we hope to. That was really the presentation today, was to look at Scrooge and some of the factors that might have brought him to the point he came to at the end of the book as a good man, from kind of a monster to a good man. And see, I think we have implications that we can make for our own journeys, for our own personalities, for looking at ourselves. But I think that we can also look beyond to transfer those values to things like politics, and to critique politics. And quite frankly, no matter whether you're right, left, center, wherever the heck you are these days, it seems to me that there is a lot that we can look at and critique and perhaps call to account. I remember, do you remember Transformed by God's Calling? That process we had in the diocese, maybe 20 years ago. Some of you just are way too young. We did. An American team came up and caused us to have a really good look at who we are and what we did. One of the things they said was that we are called to be a conscience to the world around us and to the government. When you talk about church and state, well, maybe we are to be the conscience of the state. And
You say that, I was thinking at some point earlier about the indigenous children, how miserable they are today, some of them, because they remember how awful it was. And this has really colored their whole being today. So redemption definitely is needed.
yeah, this is the parallel that is being brought up now is of the indigenous children and the difficulties they're having nowadays with all that they have been through and how they see the world. And when you think of it, of course, they were, it wasn't that their parents rejected them, it was that they were ripped out of their parents.
The pain has gone on for several generations. Because
Yes.
they never had a chance to see normal parenting in their culture. And so they had a hybrid, which frankly, the white culture that they were given was terrible. So they had nothing. And then they had children and they didn't know how to raise them, who then had children who didn't know how to raise them. And so they have a massive problem with drugs and alcohol and abuse and neglect and all the other issues
It's
that are
called the
coming up.
collective trauma.
Yeah.
We're talking about the collective trauma of these children and generation after generation after generation being essentially destroyed.
Well, you've got to look at this. What the people have said is 100% correct. Nevertheless, the people responsible, the mass of society that sponsored and approved of these residential schools would have bought in 100% every child matters. They believe that. They believe that they were considered they were the conscience of the society in which they lived. They were responsible for these primitive people. Well, I'm not saying that they were right, but they certainly believed they were right and so on. If they had checked up on the conditions in the residential schools, they might have changed their tune.
And they were warned.
And some
They were
people
warned
did,
and-
some
and-
people
Yeah,
didn't.
Yes.
but what effect did that have on the bulk of the populace?
Yeah, I think well-meaning ignorance plays a fair part in life all the time.
Yes, I was just gonna say that one profound thing I've heard, that the most unfair treatment is the equal treatment of unequals. And that's where.
The most
things are wrong.
unfair treatment is the equal treatment of unequals. Quote you correctly? Yeah, yeah, that's, and I remember actually at a diocesan meeting somewhere down by the Seaway, we had somebody, a First Nations lady, a lovely lady, come and talk to us very gently about what had gone on, and a fellow, a Brit, at the back of the room piped up and he said, "Well, I don't know what your problem is. I went to an English boarding school and it wasn't any different."
True.
Yeah, and I mean, we sort of laugh, and it was different. It certainly was, because your parents sent you there, but
It also doesn't make it okay.
no, it does not make it okay. It doesn't.
Yeah. because
No.
I heard a lady say to me once, I don't know why it matters whether they've got clean water or not. I didn't have running water when I grew up. I'm like, that doesn't make it okay. It doesn't make it okay now. It didn't make it okay when you were a child.
Alana is saying that does not make it okay. And I think that, I mean, that we're learning, and we're always going to make mistakes, and goodness knows what the world 100 years from now is going to look back and think of us, well-meaning, good folks sitting here. You know, God must love us because we go to church every Sunday. Hey, you know, what is the world going to say that we hadn't even occurred to us?
Well said, Sally.
Yeah,
Well said.
yeah, well, indeed.
It's important to be open, right? I mean, that's the whole, I keep going back to it, but I love that analogy of Scrooge's oyster, right? All closed up in a hard shell, right? And, you know, that's the whole, at the end, right? He's looking in the windows and talking to people and getting interested in their business because he's opening himself up.
And found a pearl.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly, right? And that's what we make mistakes, we all will. That's the whole, you make mistakes until you die, right? But the point is to be open to it and try and change.
And we are forgiven, and we're now kind of moving over to what redemption is about, because the world is going to think what the world thinks, and the world is going to try and fix things the way the world fixes things. But a lot of the good things that the world does in healing and stuff is what it learned from religious values. Indeed, and some of the bad things too, for sure. So discernment we need, and we need to just keep on thinking, keep on working. Look at these words. This Dickens, I think this is what you call a classic text, and a classic text is something that speaks to you through many stories, and it can tell a story to you, Elizabeth, and to you, Carl, and you may even hear a whole different story and a whole different thing that you need to hear. But the classic text, the more you read it, You read it, you change, you read it again, you change again. And that's how classic texts work. And I think to a certain extent that that's how the Christmas Carol works.
Yeah, it's almost like a Lectio Divina in a grand scale. That if you read the book or you watch the film the first time and you get an impression of this character who's mean and all the bad things about him. And then you watch it the second time and you pick up more details about the economic and social environment around him. And then the third time you see it, you realize, at least I'm just speaking generally, but the third time you realize it, that there's a call to action there. And the call to action for Scrooge, from my perspective, comes from this major crisis, a spiritual crisis that he has been able, through the gift of the spirits, to look back on his life, to look at his present life, and to look at the future. And he doesn't like it. So he has free will. So he's going to change it. And then he's going to become, how is it in the book? He's become the best man in the town, and everyone loves him. So he's had a major crisis, a spiritual crisis in life, and he's had an opportunity to make a choice and to do good in the world.
Well, next week, our topic is going to be redemption. So we've looked at Scrooge and we've looked at him this way and that way. And we've, picked him up and looked underneath and turned him over and looked at him every which way that I could think of anyway, and that you folks could put in. And we're going to see where redemption comes in. And what is it, the world has said this. I mean, we've looked at what the psychiatrist said and things like that. What is it that God said? The one thing you do know, God loves Scrooge. Oh yeah, I forgot that. Yeah. So, we're going to look at redemption and look at who we are as forgiven people. But mostly we're going to look at Scrooge. And I haven't got a clue as to where it's going next week, but that's our general destination. Anybody have anything they want to add to that?
I just want to pick up on the pearl analogy for one little half-witty remark. A pearl is formed by the introduction of a mild irritant. So you may not like the process of being pearlized. Whoever the mother of pearl is, there's going to, that's all I wanted to say. The minor irritant for me, how did Scrooge get so lucky? He had 4 ghosts. Hit him hard 4 times. If he didn't pick it up then, well, that would be it.
Well,
Whereas the rest of us, mind you, I'm not asking for 4 ghosts. I got her shoe.
You straighten him right up there.
That's all I had to say. It's not easy.
Well, Kathy was talking about the still small voice. We have the world with its how-to books, huge sections of the bookstores. Okay.
I just wanted to add one thing. I'm really struck as we come to the end of this session, that the way, we were talking about how Scrooge turns inward in order to protect himself, from harm and the nasty and really brutal world out there. But what happens, of course, is that he loses something, and we've been talking about that. One of the things that strikes me very strongly is that Scrooge loses any profound connection to community. He's cut off, and he's cut off from that. He's cut off from communities of care, communities where at least some people would understand him, with compassion and openness. And I was struck with the New Testament text, the Jesus words, what shall a man, what does a man profit if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? And so what we see is really in some ways a terrifying, story of what happens when we define who we are by what we have. I am what I have. And as soon as you say have, you have reduced everything, every single thing to a thing that you use.
Mhm,
And this is a very, very terrifying. So redemption has to be, it seems to me, a very deep movement towards community. That's one thing.
One of the things, the lovely things that I have heard is that we are not human beings seeking to become spiritual. We are spiritual beings seeking to become fully human. And that certainly gives me pause to think about where we're going on this journey, and perhaps that's the direction we'll look at a little bit. Rawls' book, I have to say, if any of you have got Rawls' book, he definitely gets into the sort of theological thinking side of things, the scriptural application of things a great more. Yes, yeah, he does. And I was a little disappointed that I didn't find enough Scroogey stuff in it.
My sentiments exactly.
Yeah, well, anyway, he gave me the idea, the redemption of Scrooge, and I thought, oh, you just say the word Scrooge, that'll catch people's thinking. Anyway, I think that perhaps we've ridden that horse pretty well. So let us finish off. In peace, we will lie down and sleep. Abide with us, Lord Jesus.
The day is now past.
As the night watch looks for the morning, so do we look for you, O Christ. And there we are. So thank you so much for coming out. Thank you, folks, for
Thank you,
being
Sally. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
all right. And hopefully we'll see y'all next week as we look at redemption.